Subscribe strategically. Join us at Strategy&Future.
Hello everybody, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome again to Strategy&Future, and today our distinguished guest, Thomas G. Mahnken. How are you?
Doing great. Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. My guest is Senior Research Professor at SAIS and also CEO of Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, the think tank that I already talked about a lot at Strategy&Future. We read a lot of reports there, including yours. So my audience knows sort of, your output, so to speak. So let's dive right from the scratch deep. You co-authored the text that recently was published in the US. It's a in public availability, so everybody can download it. Within the bigger volume of different many authors titled "War in Ukraine," where you suggested that there were some fallacies as regards Western and US strategy and expert field fallacies in strategizing, broadly speaking, about the implications, consequences, the conduct, events leading to war. Could you expand a little bit more, maybe on things that you didn't touch in the text, or that maybe were too you wanted to, but it maybe you wanted to add something? My audience, I already talked about this text towards my to my audience, so they know it. But it's always better to hear directly from the author,
Well, first, it's great. It's wonderful to be with you. Big fan of this series, and so it's a pleasure to be on. And look, also, I would say thanks and congratulations to the editor of the volume, Professor Hal Brands, for as somebody who's edited volumes before. It's basically a thankless task. But he deserves a lot of thanks for bringing everybody together and in such a timely manner. And I would definitely recommend the book to your audience. As you say, it's available for open access, so no excuse not to read it. But it was my pleasure to be able to contribute to the volume. Among other things, it gave me an opportunity to move ahead with a project that I've been working on for too many years without coming to a conclusion. And so that project is all about strategists' fallacies. So a lot of people who write about strategy, including myself, we tend to write about it in positive terms. What are the ways that soldiers and statesmen should be thinking about strategy? And this present project, some of which you see in the book chapter, is all about how all too often strategists make mistakes. And so the book, when I eventually finish the book, but also in the chapter, you see that these fallacies are binned into a number of families. So fallacies of rationality, right? So we can come back and talk about that. We can talk about fallacies of assessment, fallacies of implementation, interaction, and then even thinking about strategies of war termination. So my basic approach here was to take the war in Ukraine as a case study in fallacious thinking about strategy. And the good and bad news here is that we had lots to draw from. So my co-author Josh Baker and I had kind of a rich treasure trove of fallacious statements about war, about Vladimir Putin's Russia, about Ukraine, about the Ukraine war, about Western assistance to Ukraine, again, to draw from. So that was really, the origin of the piece. And yeah, I'd be happy to take it in any direction you'd like to delve deeper into any of those aspects.
Yeah, let's talk about this rationality, the test of a reasonable man that in the past had already led us to many false assumptions. Like the most, I think, famous, at least in the Polish circles of strategists, is this fallacy of thinking that Hitler would be such a gambler to start a war on the continent back in the late 30s, attacking Poland, that he wouldn't pass the test of a reasonable man. So how was that in case of Ukraine and Putin?
Yeah. Look, I think you're pointing to something that is certainly deeper than Ukraine and deeper than Vladimir Putin, right? I think it's pretty deeply ingrained. I'll say as an American, in the American strategic psyche, that we view war as the breakdown of policy rather than its continuation, right? As Clausewitz teaches us, and so we tend to think of, if war occurs, it's because of somebody acting irrationally rather than pursuing their aims, and those aims being so valuable that they're willing to use force. So I think it's certainly a persistent theme in not just, as you say, in the case of Poland, but for the U.S. as well, to think about I talk about the fallacy of the irrationality of war, and that's that basic notion that war itself is irrational. And then related to that are a pair of fraternal twins, as they call them. First is the irrationality of the adversary, and so that's to your point of Hitler would have to be irrational to use force, or in this case, Vladimir Putin would be irrational to use force. It didn't make sense. And then the fraternal twin of that is the fallacy of the hyper-rational adversary. And so on the one hand, the irrational adversary, again, we in the US tend to, I'd say, disregard adversaries and just say, well, they're crazy. On the other hand, we've tended to set up adversaries as being just perfectly rational, like the world's greatest chess player.
I think Kissinger wrote about Stalin and the perception of Stalin in the eyes of both Roosevelt and for sure Churchill, that he was seen as a vicious, cold-minded and intelligent person who was playing the cynical game of geopolitics with shrewdness. And in doing so, Stalin also highly saw his teammates or players like Roosevelt and Churchill, and they were not that viciously geopolitical thinkers, such thinkers. So he overplayed the hand because he was thinking that they are as shrewd as he is, kind of sort of thing. Yeah, but you know.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think the real root of each of those fallacies, both of the irrational adversary and the hyper-rational adversary, is a lack of strategic empathy. So I think it comes down to an inability to empathize, and of course, empathy is very different than sympathy, but an inability to empathize with our adversaries. So, we on the one hand would say, I think it was all too common, still is all too common in the United States. Oh, Vladimir Putin can't possibly believe this particular version of Russian history. That's crazy. He's just mouthing it as propaganda. No, I think he does believe it, even if it's wrong, even if it's factually wrong. And then similarly, to believe that ideas, history, perceptions, misperceptions don't motivate people, as you say, then that you can fall prey to this trap of the hyper-rational adversary.
Yeah, it all boils down basically to the strategy culture, and there are different strategy cultures stemming from many factors, including history and experience. And whatever we say about Russia, they have a distinct strategy culture, and probably Putin knows better how to maneuver within it than we in the West. But my question to that particular topic is concentrating on the U.S. Some people say hubris. Some people would say that overemphasis of U.S. primacy. Maybe the reason why, across the pond you keep thinking like that is because you've been living in the world of the American primacy for so long that if something on the perimeter or on the peripheria is, growing, something is changing. And even to include war, even as a breakup of the international system, then this is something completely unnatural. to the primacy, because primacy advocates for stability, because there is a hierarchical order when there are principles, rules of the road. And how would you react to that?
Look, I wouldn't deny that that may be part of it, but I think if you look at American strategic culture and American strategic history, you know, it's much deeper than that. So I think it's just part of our genetic makeup to think that peace is the natural state of things, and that wars are temporary, inconvenient aberrations from that natural norm of peace. And that was true, you know, in the early 20th century when the United States was far from a global power. It was true in the late 1930s. It was true, you know, during the Cold War. So I think I'm not discounting primacy as being maybe an element of it, but I just think it's even deeper than that when it comes to the American psyche. We just see peace as the natural state, and war as a deviation from that.
You know, does it also have something to do with the fact that across the 20th century and the United States became a primary power? Let's not focus on primacy, but a kind of a leading power in the system. It's still a kind of shied away for the typical European style old school balancing game, as opposed to either a Wilsonian concept of the international order or some sort of primacy, whatever we call it, something that is not that natural in the history of Europe, where the balancing game was the name of the game. So, you know, and that's why maybe this difficulty in understanding that war might be a continuation, especially different kinds of war, hybrid war, you know, not a general war anyways. What do you think? Maybe we're entering the period of anarchy in the international system when it's going to be like a common thing. What do you think?
No, look, I think there's definitely something to that. I would say also aiding and abetting that is geography, right? So the fact that we are, you know, we're geographically distant from most sources of conflict, whether they're in Europe or in Asia, whether we are and have historically been guarded by two oceans and a powerful navy. Most wars for us have been elective. And I think that's nurtured this view that war is something that happens over there to other people and is something that's unusual, even if that's is out of touch with reality, and frankly has been out of touch with reality for decades. It's still the case that, you know, for Americans, war usually comes first somewhere other than our own shores.
So in that context, what do you think about the real reasons for war in Ukraine and the apparent failure of deterrence? Because, you know, whatever we may say, at the end of the day, President Biden tried to deter by threatening Putin with serious consequences if he invades Ukraine, and still he did it. He invaded. So,
yeah, look, I don't know. I'm really of two minds over Ukraine as a failure of deterrence, and I say that because I think Putin, you know, as a man, was so invested in Ukraine, returning Ukraine to the fold. I think it's a good question. You know, what would actually have deterred him? You know, let's think about it again. I'm thinking about it from an American perspective, and let's think about it in terms of, you know, classic deterrence theory. Well, the easiest things to deter are attacks upon yourself, right? So central deterrence.
sure.
And soldiers, statesmen, scholars have struggled over shoring up central deterrence over decades. And then there's the trickier, thornier prospect of extended deterrence. Of course, that's extending deterrence to allies, such as our NATO allies, where we have a treaty obligation. And again, we can go back across decades and see all the hand-wringing and difficulties of trying to not just deter, but also assure allies.
Yeah.
Now you throw in Ukraine, not as an ally, I'd say as a friend, and I just wonder how much weight that, that concept of deterrence would bear in that case. So I think that's still very much an open question. What isn't an open question, right, is that Vladimir Putin earnestly, sincerely, probably every waking day, thought about returning Ukraine to the fold, and in the end decided to take action. Now, I'll be the first one to say that there's more that the United States and others could have done and should have done before February of 2022 to assist Ukraine in defending itself. I just wonder what threats the United States, others could have made that would have dissuaded Vladimir Putin. I think that's a good conversation, good topic for discussion and debate.
Yeah, for example, insertions of troops, including Air Force, for some reason, into Ukraine would be very escalatory, but at the same time, maybe it would have a deterrent effect. We will not know that. It's, I mean, the issue is over. But there were such debates here in our intermarium, in this Black Sea and Baltic Sea region, because we are contemplating whether extended deterrence works to our favor, going forward to the future, because the deterrence is always in the eyes of the beholder. So, we were wondering how Putin would react. And my last question on that particular topic is, do you think that this sort of posturing that the United States did prior to the war, in the last days prior to the war, sharing this intelligence information, was helpful or, not in deterring war? There are a lot of discussions among scholars. What did it really do?
Yeah. So let me actually zoom out a little bit and go beyond just deterring war, because obviously it didn't prevent Vladimir Putin from attacking Ukraine. But I do think the information sharing was valuable in at least two ways. First, we can measure its value in terms of all the narratives that we didn't talk about in February of 22 and aren't talking about now, right? So sharing the intelligence was valuable in beating back false Russian narratives. So, right, we're even in the very first days of the Russian invasion, we weren't talking about Ukrainian attacks on Russia. We weren't talking about Ukrainian Nazis, things like that. So I think it was the information sharing was valuable in beating back false narratives. Second, and I think more importantly, I think that intelligence sharing was vital to getting NATO to act early and decisively. So NATO, not always the most nimble and decisive of alliances, actually did behave nimbly and did act decisively. And I really think that habit of information sharing that was developed in the months leading up to the attack on Ukraine really was important. So in terms of deterrence, no. But in terms of serving as the glue for unified action, yes. And I would say, much of the work that I've been doing on, we call it at CSBA, we talk a lot about deterrence by detection, which we were talking about that several years before.
We should even a report on that. Yeah, I mean, you can access it on the CSBA website.
Yeah, and part one is that sharing real-time intelligence may in fact deter. But part two is, even if it doesn't deter, it can serve to help coalesce unified, timely action. And at least in Ukraine, we saw the latter, even if we didn't see the former.
Moving forward into the future, we are recording our conversation in the beginning of May 2024, second or even third year into the war in Ukraine. So what do you think there might be some future or incoming fallacies of Western strategizing that you sense might be somewhere in the air already. Let's speculate a little bit. At the end of the day, real strategy is about predicting future, isn't it?
Sure.
Otherwise,
or forecasting, or certainly it's about
shaping it. Yes,
exactly. So look, I think I'd raise a couple of areas. So one, and this is looking back, but also looking forward, has to do with fallacies of interaction, right? So I think early on, there were too many people that somehow imagined that the Russian invaders were acting on some sort of inanimate force as opposed to the people, the government, the military of Ukraine. And I think that was a major failure. I think the Russians who planned the invasion similarly thought about their adversary as not being interactive, as sort of being pliable. But then I think that fallacy of lack of interaction, script writing, wound up being applied to the Russians, right? Just the fact that the Russians wound up failing in their initial campaign. Too many people assumed that, well, they wouldn't adapt. And I think what we've seen is war. And war is a competitive process of adaptation. And so I think the Russians are doing better at adaptation than they were. But I think that continued interaction is something we really need to pay attention to. Second, I think we need to be thinking about war termination. And early on, I think at the very earliest stage, there was the belief that the Russians would win decisively. Then there was hope that the Ukrainians would win decisively. I still think that's a possibility, but again, it kind of goes back to our desire, at least as Americans, I'd say, to wish war away, is to think that, well, we're going to find a solution once and for all to this conflict. And I just, again, we're several years into this conflict. I don't think it's likely to go away. That having been said, and it's kind of a broader conversation about protracted conflicts, I think we can also fixate too much on one element of the conflict and ignore others. And in this case, the front lines are important. The situation on the ground is important, but it's not the only thing that's going on. And in the end, it may not prove to be decisive. And here the historian in me comes out. And I'd say if we looked at the Western Front of World War I in the middle of 1918, what would we see? We would see, we'd see largely static front lines. We'd actually see a big German offensive that actually succeeded in some ways much better than the initial offensive of 1914, but then followed by Germany's collapse. And so I think, the ground campaign in Ukraine is important, but there's also an air and missile campaign going on. There's a naval campaign, sort of a strategic information campaign going on, and strategic strike campaign. Those are all playing out together. And I think, we can get overly fixated on one dimension of the conflict and lose the bigger strategic picture.
Okay, but what does that mean in practical terms? That we should think about the theory of victory for Ukraine. That's question number one. Question number two is: do you view this war as part of the broader conflict emerging because the world system has been broken and the new balance is being shaped, and it will take several years, even more, a dozen years to create it? And this is just one of the symptoms. Many more to come, maybe, including economic battles and technology battles across. And how should we think about the theory of victory in that respect, and especially whose victory? US victory, Ukraine victory, European victory, Western victory? How would you comment on that?
So a couple of great questions. My first flippant answer is, how long do we have? Because those are very rich topics. So let me talk about the theory of victory, right? And I'll just say that This takes us all the way back to Clausewitz, right? And Clausewitz talks about two types of wars: wars for unlimited aims or wars for limited aims. I think it's actually one of his most profound insights. And if you go back to On War, it was an afterthought. I mean, it was after finishing book one, chapter one of On War, he writes himself this note for a revision, and then, unfortunately dies before he can fully implement it. But it's one of the great insights. So either you're fighting a war to overthrow your adversary, to impose a peace upon your adversary, or you're fighting a war for limited aims. You're fighting over territory. You're fighting over things that are decided at negotiations. And Russia certainly entered this war with unlimited aims, right? Seeking to overthrow the government in Kyiv. We're focused now on, I think, some sort of a negotiated settlement. But I think there still is the possibility, and I couldn't presume to speak to or speak for the government in Kyiv, but at least as an observer, look at Ukrainian military operations, I think they really are geared not just towards the limited aim of gaining back a little bit of territory, but the aim of gaining back all Ukrainian territory. And I think that at this point, that would really require a political change in Moscow. And so I think you could see that go any number of ways. And I still think also that Putin and those around him are still looking to change the government in Kyiv. So, either the war is going to end with some sort of a negotiated settlement, even if that's a ceasefire or turns it into a frozen conflict, or I think one of the two sides is really gonna buckle under. So that's what I would say there. In terms of how we think about this conflict, look, I think it's instructive. Again, back to strategic empathy. I think for Putin and those around him, this is the first campaign of World War III. Meaning, and I've heard Russian interlocutors speak in these terms, and again, I don't think they're speaking propagandistically. I think they're speaking because this is what they genuinely believe, is that they see this ultimately as being a global war. I've heard Russian interlocutors say that the final result of this war will be to the benefit of China and to the detriment of the West. And I treat them as mature adults who say what they believe. And so that's the way that they, at least, some people conceptualize this. And if you look at it, at least on the authoritarian side, one sees developing this sort of axis of authoritarianism, with Russia, with China, with North Korea, and Iran all playing their roles. And we see an axis of democracy, or a democratic alliance, forming on the other side. Now, I hope it doesn't amount to that, but I can certainly see that emerging. Authoritarian regimes cooperating with each other across the theaters. And what we certainly see on the Western side, right, is Western liberal democracies collaborating with each other across theaters as well, right, with liberal democracies from Asia supporting Ukraine as an example, not just European NATO members.
Thomas, are we really seeing it? Let me be, the advocate. Devil's advocate, okay? Are we really seeing this cooperation among the Western allies? As we speak, Xi Jinping is visiting Paris.
Right.
Right. A few days ago, Chancellor Scholz visited Beijing. Mm-hmm. There is a major reshuffle in the global economy, moving away. U.S. importance is ebbing away from Eurasia in that respect. So and I'm talking as a person located here in Eurasia, and you are across the ocean. And my next question would pertain to this particular thing. and it will touch upon the sound strategy for the United States, how to deal with that. Many scholars, many observers in Eurasia, especially in the Western European countries, always complain that in this new era of great power competition, that's the phrase that's used at CSBA and the US Pentagon documents and elsewhere, the United States has not provided and delivered a sound, logical strategy of how United States is going to continue to have primacy and sustain the world order based on the rules of law, the rules of the road, the principles that would cement also the democracies and the liberal West. That no such speech that would provide detailed arguments, not narratives, but detailed arguments that would convince the German industry and the French industry to really be with you, that this has not been provided. Would you react? And maybe this is one of the fallacies of the US strategy towards Eurasia. What do you think?
Well, one of my first observations is to be, an ally of the United States is to be perpetually dissatisfied with the United States. And I've seen that, in different manifestations across the decades. But I think in the end, it's better to be an ally of the United States than a servant of China or Russia. So, look, I would say
Thomas, understand. It's important because people ask me this question, and really in many debates in Europe, you can hear it. It's fine to say that, but tell it to the, labor worker in Bavaria who's going to get busted because you will ban the Chinese industry from accessing the Allied market, and he will be unemployed, and it will be 30% of unemployment in Germany. How would you explain to the German politicians to be, with you on that matter? Because the social contract is broken,
Right. So no, you're actually getting to my next point, which is, look, I don't think it's the business of the US government to be preaching to like German industry or German workers. I think it's the job of the US to be working with our allies and allied governments to craft a unified strategy. And I think, can I make the argument that it's in Germany's interest to put real limits on Chinese investment? Yeah, I can. I mean, and I think we have, in fact, the good case study where past German governments, again, since you chose Germany as an example, where past German governments were not so careful in their economic interactions with Russia, and we see what that has led to in Germany. So I guess in the end, the major appeal is not out of some sort of misty-eyed patriotism or anything like that. It's about national self-interest. And so I'd say one of the virtues of the United States as an ally, as a Western liberal democracy, is a respect for sovereignty. It's and in fact, like, safeguarding sovereignty, whereas we've got plenty of examples with Russia and China, frankly, Iran in a minor sort of way, and I guess the North Koreans would do it if they were active enough and powerful enough in Europe to do it, where they don't respect that. So I mean, that's the ultimate argument. And where that, I think where that takes me is, look, I think it's not about U.S. primacy. It's about the U.S. and our allies collaborating more effectively together and across theaters. And we could talk about like that those forms of collaboration. I think they have to do with defense industry. I think they have to do with basing. They have to do with truly kind of allied strategy. And I think that is where the future is, not because the United States desires it, but because it's manifestly in the self-interest of our allies.
If I may continue down this path. So, during the Cold War, the approach was a bit different on part of the United States. The United States was the biggest economy. It opened up to the allies, to their products. It provided security umbrella, including the nuclear extended deterrence, and it provided the Marshall Plan, okay, to the allies, so that to kind of consolidate them around the United States and its interests and the free world. And it's not happening this time around. In this new Cold War, this new era of confrontation, it's not happening. How would you explain that to Europeans? Is it a fallacy or it's a premeditated strategy of the United States?
Well, look, we have different starting conditions to begin with, right? I mean, I think, look, the Marshall Plan was, I think, you know, was an act of great altruism, frankly, but it wasn't just altruism. And yes, it helped, you know, rebuild a devastated Europe. What we have today is not a devastated Europe, right? We have, thanks to that, among other things, and to the industriousness of Europeans, we have a much stronger Europe, but a Europe that perhaps, you know, in some cases, is not fully carrying its weight when it comes to its own self-defense. So I'd say there's different starting conditions. I think the Europe of today is much more capable. European industry is much more capable, obviously, than it was in the late 40s, early 50s.
Cool.
And so as we think that through, you're right. We need to be doing, we in the United States need to be doing more with our European allies, to just take that example, since we're focused on Europe. And similarly, our allies need to be doing more with us. And there are barriers, right? There are barriers on both sides. A lot of those barriers are domestic political barriers. So, you know, for example, I believe strongly that the U.S., if we just stick to defense, you know, just about everything that we produce in the defense sphere should be produced with an eye towards export. That can be difficult for bureaucracies to do. They're not apt to think about sharing first and foremost. I also think there are cases where allies have better solutions than we have at home, and we should be open to imports. Again, that's something that bureaucracies and legislatures, parliaments, Congress don't often do naturally. And I think if you flip it around from a European perspective, you can see the same thing. So we need to, in a way, get back to the Cold War habit of genuinely thinking of our allies as partners and resources. Again, I think it's a byproduct of a positive era, collapse of the Soviet Union, and where we didn't really have to worry, at least for a period, about security threats. Well, then we focused on allies as commercial competitors, and they focused on us as commercial competitors rather than being security partners. And I think we just need to get back to that, albeit, again, in different conditions than we faced together in the 1940s.
Yeah, you know, going towards the end of our conversation, let's maybe move to the most pertinent subject of contemporary discussions in terms of strategy, Taiwan. At CSBA, I think you were the first to initiate this debate about the air sea battle concept, you know, many years ago. I even wrote a book here in Polish about that, and where I broadly cited you guys, including yourself.
Yeah.
And that was really so fresh at that time, you know, just to read that. So I really great appreciation for your work at CSBA. And you know, speaking again about fallacies of strategy, we will have a new term of presidency in the United States. We are having this Taiwan thing. We are having this great competition between US and China. What could be the fallacies of the strategies towards Taiwanese issue, Taiwanese question in the coming months and years, in your personal opinion? You know,
yeah.
Whether, you know, for example, raising the issue of independence would be a fallacy or not. Maybe insertion of US troops into Taiwan for military
Sure.
would be a fallacy, or no? On the other hand, no.
Right.
Increasing the numbers of ships transiting Taiwan Strait would be a fallacy or not? What are your opinions about those issues?
Yeah, look, so some of these fallacies have their root in just basics of strategy and war. So one of the things I would talk about in the case of Taiwan, we certainly saw in the case of Russia and Ukraine, is just has to do with the difficulty of understanding a future war from the perspective of peace, right? We have a tendency to overestimate one side, underestimate another side. And certainly in the case of Ukraine, there's a real tendency to overestimate the Russians and underestimate the Ukrainians. I think we need to be alive to that when it comes to China, Taiwan. And it is certainly true that the PLA has been undertaking a dedicated buildup with an eye towards coercing, potentially conquering Taiwan. But we shouldn't let that blind us to potential weaknesses in the PLA. So I think that's certainly one element of it. I think we can also comfort ourselves too much by looking at the war in Ukraine and deriving lessons when it comes to Taiwan that are congenial to us. Whereas I think it's absolutely the case that the Chinese are learning their own lessons. And some of the lessons that they're learning may not be so congenial. So, for example, the Russians obviously failed in decapitating the Ukrainian government in Kyiv.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the PLA will just think that that's a fool's errand and not try? No, they'll probably redouble their efforts. So just because the Russians failed at decapitation doesn't mean that the Chinese aren't going to try it. Similarly, I think the Russians have, say, unfortunately, gotten good mileage out of rattling the nuclear saber. And I would expect the Chinese, you already see it in their nuclear modernization. I think we can expect to see it in terms of declaratory policy. They'll try to, get even more mileage out of making coercive nuclear threats. So I think we need to learn from that, that fallacious thinking of the past. Similarly, when Xi Jinping says, he is invested in reunifying China and Taiwan, I think we should take him at his word. We should treat him as a mature adult and not just somebody who's just making things up. So we need to take these prospects very seriously. And then finally, and again, this is one of the big imponderables of war. People talk a lot about, well, what is the will to resist of the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese people. I think the thing that I would pay attention to is people, including those in Moscow, had real questions about the Ukrainians' willingness to resist before February 22nd, 2022, right? And so I think it would be a mistake to sell short the Taiwanese people, the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese military in that respect.
Sure. I remember myself being apparently and overly pessimistic about the prospect of Ukraine defense. And I was in DC in the weeks prior to war, and I hadn't met an expert who would say that Ukraine might really resist. Yeah. So that was, this is very interesting. I mean, the history of warfare, it will be often cited, as a sort of case where at Kiev, Ukrainians changed the history, including the change of history of the intermarium and ponad in a way. We will see how it will end up, but they already did it. So, yeah, we'll see. Okay, I would have like tons of more questions to you, but we agreed for a specified amount of time. So maybe my last question, okay, to you is again, don't shy away from speculating, if I may ask. What do you think, how and when the war in Ukraine would end? What would be your bet?
Look, I think, and look, and speculation is fine, but informed speculation is even better. And so, look, I think it ends one of two ways. It ends either as something like a frozen conflict with Russian forces on some parts of Ukrainian territory, or it ends with Ukraine recovering all of its territory. And I think if the latter, again, that's going to require a political change in Moscow. And so we have, if you will, what if there was an armistice mid 1918 versus what actually happened November 11th, 1918, where you actually have a collapse on one side. And oh, by the way, I mean, just so that we don't get too starry-eyed when it comes to that, let's also remember all the things that happened after November 11th, 1918 in Germany, certainly in Poland, in the Soviet Union, all the things that surrounded the end of that war. So I'm not positing that as just sort of the end of history, or but so I think those are sort of the two basic branches that I can see, and I'm not a gambling man, so I'm not gonna wager how it turns out. But those are the two branches that I would see.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you very much. My guest today was Thomas G. Mahnken, distinguished strategist, as we can hear. Thank you very much, and looking forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
My pleasure.